Hello everyone, today we are at the Tank Museum at Bovington and we take a look at the Sherman Firefly. So what are the main differences between a regular Sherman and the Sherman Firefly? I mean, the obvious one is a 17-pounder gun, of course, but there are others, like the crew is reduced from 5 to 4, which means there's no hull machine gun. That is basically here, it's welded over. Then the turret is turned around, so there's an extra box added behind for the radio. And the radio is also very important because now the loader is also the radio man, which on the tactical sense creates quite some problems because for coordination, if he has to load the gun during combat, he can't really at the same time talk and coordinate with the other units. Of course, if you add a bigger gun and you add a box for the radio and everything, the weight also increases a bit, even if you reduce the amount of crew. So normally it was about 32 metric tons, the Firefly is about 35 metric tons.
First, a bit of background on the naming. The origin of the name Firefly is unknown. Although we know that it appeared in war diaries, as such it was not a post-war invention. Officially, the designation for Fireflies in the British Army was with a C after the Roman numeral, like Sherman 5C. The British called the M for Sherman 1, the M for A1 Sherman 2, the M for A2 Sherman 3, etc. As such, due to availability or better lack of availability of some Sherman variants in the British Army, there were technically only the Sherman 1C, 1C Hybrid, and 5C. If not otherwise stated in this video, we look at the 5C. Let us take a look at the origins next. The initial design idea, according to Fletcher and Zaloga, came from Major George Brighty. Although the British were working on the A30, later known as Challenger, which was based on the Cromwell that had a turret that looks like the size of a barn with a 17-pounder in it. Brighty supposedly thought that the Sherman would be a better 17-pounder carrier. The main issue was that the turret of the Sherman was too small and the substantial recoil of the 17-pounder needed a lot of space that was simply not there. As such, a rework of the recoil system was needed. This was the stage Brighty had reached when he was joined by an old colleague, another Royal Tank Regiment major named George Viveridge, who, as it happened, was also bent on improving the firepower of the Sherman. The difference was that Viveridge had experienced the inadequacy of the firepower of British and American tanks firsthand. Viveridge was particularly interested in having a proper high explosive round. The reason for this was that the British Army had a particularly track record of having guns with no HE rounds, which was a major issue if you're trying to fight anti-tank guns. Additionally, he was also not particularly fond of the A30 Challenger. Brighty tried to solve the recoil problem the hard way, namely by fixing the gun into the turret in a way that the recoil would be absorbed by the mass of the tank and its suspension. Several test shots were fired and it worked, but not everybody was truly convinced that this was a good idea after all. Yet the Department of Tank Design ordered that the work on upgunning the Sherman should be ceased. Sadly, we don't know the exact reasons for this. So why did we still get a Firefly in the end? Well, in August 1943, a new director of the Royal Armoured Corps was appointed. He was able to convince other people to continue work on upgunning the Sherman. This also meant that the project became now more official and the gun recoil problem would be handled by professional engineers. The recoil system was reworked, but the barrel also needed more support, since the original cradle for the barrel was shortened for the turret installation as well. This problem was solved as well, but there was more. If Kilburn, who was the leading engineer, thought that he had solved the problem with these modifications to the gun, he was wrong. The ingenuity he had employed to fit the weapon into the tank was commendable, but there were other matters to consider, in particular the crew and the ammunition. The big gun with a strong recoil guard behind the bridge virtually divided the turret into two halves. This meant that the loader on the left side of the gun would find it very difficult to escape in a hurry if the tank were to be hit and blew up. It would mean wriggling under the gun, climbing on the commander's seat and then sliding through his hatch. The solution was to create a hatch for the loader on the left side, which had another advantage. It made it a lot easier to pass the larger rounds that were required for the big gun into the turret for storage. Another issue was that the ammo for the 17-pounder was larger and heavier. This created various problems. To solve this, the breech ring was redesigned so that the block moved sideways and not up and down. So stating that the gun was just rotated by 90 degrees is a bit of an understatement. The prototype guns were successful and finally everything was put together. In January 1944, the inspection of the prototype Sherman Firefly was performed, and the War Office had ordered 2,100 initially. This became even more important once it was clear that the A-30 Challenger would not be ready for D-Day. But more on that later. Let us take a look at some technical aspects next. First, we look at firepower. After all, that is the reason we got the Firefly in the first place. In terms of armor penetration, the 17-pounder was a powerful gun. This data is for a 30-degree angle based on a British report from February 1944. We look at the values for the APC-BZ and the APDFS SV rounds. So armor-piercing cap ballistic cap and armor-piercing discarding sabot super velocity. The latter was rather rare and came with a major problem we will discuss later. For the APC-BZ round, the penetration value at point blank was 132 mm. At 600 yards it was 125 mm. At 1000 yards it was 120 mm. At 2000 yards it was 107 mm. Meanwhile, for the APDS SV round, the value at point blank was 201 mm. At 600 yards it was 183 mm. At 1000 yards it was 172 mm. And at 2000 yards it was still 145 mm. The British report also has the values for the 88mm guns of the Tiger I and the Königstiger for a comparison. For the APC-BZ rounds, we have the following. At point blank, 121 and 160 mm. At 600 yards, 110 and 148 mm. At 1000 yards, 103 and 140 mm. And at 2000 yards, 86 and 121 mm. So while the APDS SV round outperformed both German guns, the APCB only outperformed the gun from the Tiger I. Although the APDS SV round was extremely inaccurate beyond 500 yards, so this does not represent the overall effectiveness of the guns. Yet probably more interesting is how the gun performed against the frontal armor of some tanks. The values shown are the effective armor thickness of the upper hull front of the Cromwell, which had 64 mm, the M4A3 Sherman had 87 mm, the T-34-85 had 90 mm, the Panzer IV-H had 81 mm, the Panther A had 139 mm, and the Tiger I 102 mm. So if these numbers are correct, the APC-BZ round would penetrate all these tanks except the Panther at 1.8 kilometers, while technically the Panther might even survive a point-blank hit from the APC-BZ round. Meanwhile, the high-velocity sabot round would have no issue penetrating any tank, frontally even at 2000 yards. The main issue was that hitting the tank in the first place with it, which we will discuss soon.
Now the 17-pounder also had some drawbacks, namely the initial shots created a very strong flash that to a certain degree blinded or dazed the crew, and this was particularly an issue with the high explosive projectile. And this was later charged by the introduction of a cartridge that had a reduced charge. Now some might argue, well, that's not a big problem because it's all about killing tanks. Well, it's noted by one author about 75% of all shots were actually high explosive shots. And so yeah, we always think about killing tanks with other tanks, but in real life combat a lot of times high explosive shots were more often used than armor piercing.
Yet there were other issues as well, namely accuracy. The regular APC-BZ ammunition was quite accurate, yet the problem was the high velocity sabot ammo, which outperformed the gun of the Königstiger. Schiffer notes in his video about the 17-pounder's accuracy that the British wartime documentation stated that the Firefly sabot ammo was so inaccurate that it was not worth shooting at targets at over 500 yards, and the Americans noted that even at lower ranges. A British report from September 1944 noted hit chance on the Panther turret at 400 yards, so about 365 meters, at 50%, whereas with regular ammo it would be 90%. One aspect that related to accuracy was the reduction in the traverse speed of the turret. According to Zaloga and Fletcher, this actually was an improvement since the slowest traverse speed allowed for better gun laying. Another issue in regard to firepower was ammo count and reloading speed. Due to the larger size of the ammo count was reduced from 97 main gun rounds to 77 rounds. One issue here was proper arrangement. 5 rounds were directly stored in the bins in the turret, then another 18 rounds that were located at the feet of the loader. All the other ammunition was in places that were harder to reach. As such, Fletcher and Zaloga note, all of which meant that under average circumstances the gun of a Firefly had just 23 rounds available to him, after which there would be a pause while the turret crew replenished ready rounds. Yet initially, the situation for ammo storage and reloading for individual crews was likely worse. If the processes outlined above seem too organized and thoroughly worked out, it is probably true to say that this was more by accident than design. Although crews were instructed in the use of new tanks before they went to war, this would have been just the barest minimum of experience. And it seems highly likely that the details were worked out by individual regiments in the field. In terms of rate of fire, one author notes 10 rounds per minute. He notes for the Tiger 1 rate of fire 15 rounds per minute. Fletcher and Zaloga note that for the 18 rounds at the feet of the loader, the motion for reloading took about 9 to 10 seconds, which would actually mean 6 to 7 rounds per minute. Yet there was another issue. Since the crew was reduced to 4 men and the positioning, the loader also acted as a radio man. In combat, loaders were engrossed in loading the tank's main armament that they were hard-pressed to operate the vehicle's communications effectively. This made it more difficult for Fireflies to operate successfully as part of a larger tank unit. So although the 17-pounder gun was formidable, the various circumstances to making it work in the Sherman lowered the tactical effectiveness of the Firefly on the battlefield. Under ideal circumstances, this probably did not matter much, yet in prolonged engagements and/or those that required a higher level of coordination, this clearly would have had an impact. So let us look at armor protection next. The frontal upper armor was 51mm at 56 degrees, the hull side was 38mm, the hull rear also had 38mm, although at 0 to 20 degree. The hull roof had 90mm, the turret front had 76mm at 30 degree, the turret side and rear had 51mm, the turret roof 25mm. It was the same as the M4A4 Sherman, which the Sherman VC Firefly was based on. Overall, it was a good armor package for a medium tank at the time. Of course, the protection against Sherman 75mm guns at a range of 500 meters was limited, that most shots would easily penetrate, except the turret front. Against the long-barrel 88mm tank and anti-tank guns, at all ranges the shot would penetrate. But those guns could also deal with heavy tanks, so no surprise here. Now, a drawback in the firepower department was actually a benefit in the armor protection department. According to Fletcher and Zaloga, the different ammo loadout had also a benefit, since most of the ammo was now located below the turret floor. Fireflies brewing up was less common. Keep in mind that tanks exploding is generally a result of ammunition propellant fire, not petrol or diesel, as the uninitiated think. Next is mobility. Although the Sherman Firefly had a few more tons than the regular Sherman, the overall mobility was the same as the regular Sherman. One source gives the following metrics. 425 horsepower at 2850 revolutions per minute, maximum road speed 36 km per hour, maximum cross-country speed 17 km per hour, operational range on the road 201 km and operational range cross-country 145 km. Another aspect is of course ergonomics. The short version is that the gun was a bit too big for the turret, as such it was cramped. For the long version I suggest you watch Schiffer's video about the Firefly, where he gets into it. The combat debut of the Firefly was in Normandy. Initially one platoon, or a troop as the British called platoons, of Fireflies would cover 3 platoons of Shermans or Cromwells. This was soon changed to provide each platoon with 1 Firefly. John Buckley notes that despite the drawbacks, the 17-pounder equipped tank, however, represented a major firepower advance for the Allies, and crews appreciated the potency of the new combination of the high-velocity gun and reliable vehicle. The greatest hindrance to its Having a major impact on the campaign, however, was the shortage of the numbers. Only 84 on 11th June, 149 by the end of the month, and 235 by the end of July 1944. Ultimately, it was the 75mm tank gun that had to shoulder the burden of dealing with German armor. Another issue with the Firefly numbers is noted by Fletcher and Zaloga, namely that regular tanks, although suffering higher losses, had more replacements. The Firefly also saw action in Italy, although Normandy was prioritized. As such, it did not arrive in Italy until October 1944, and was also quite rare there. By February 1945, 2002 Fireflies had been supplied to the troops. As such, each platoon could now field 2 instead of 1 Firefly. At this point, production was slowed down, since the Firefly was not needed in the Pacific due to the lack of well-armored Japanese tanks. And of course, that a proper replacement was incoming, namely the A-34 Comet. To summarize, the Sherman Firefly was basically a British sidegrade of the Sherman, to have better anti-tank killing capabilities, although at the cost of reduced ergonomics, crew, coordination capability, and firepower against non-armored targets. So it was a worse tank than the regular Sherman, but clearly a better tank killer. Considering the popularity of the Firefly among the British troops, and the Americans at least considering getting some of their own, it shows that it was considered successful, at least on the tactical level.
A big thank you to the Tank Museum in Bovington for inviting me. Thank you to the supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar for supporting me. Thank you for watching and see you next time.